My ex-wife took out a loan in my name and bought a luxury house for her lover. So I did this. My name is Leonardo Vasquez. I am 68 years old, a retired man whose existence has been carefully erased from the lives of those who once claimed to love me. To my children, my ex-wife, and the colleagues who once shook my hand with respect, I am already dead. Not in any literal sense, of course. My heart still beats its steady rhythm, my lungs still draw breath, and every morning at precisely 6 a.m., and I emerge from restless sleep to begin another day in this carefully constructed prison I call life. The ritual never changes. Strong, bitter coffee, the kind that burns your throat and jolts your system awake. I tend to my garden with the same meticulous care I once applied to architectural blueprints, treating each plant like a sacred responsibility. Long walks stretch through my afternoons, my weathered legs carrying me past houses where families still gather around dinner tables, where children's laughter spills from open windows like music I can no longer hear in my own home. But to those who are supposed to matter most, I have become nothing more than an uncomfortable echo from a past they'd rather forget. A living, breathing reminder that time moves forward, leaving some of us behind. 6 long years have passed since I handed in my hard hat and walked away from nearly 4 decades as a civil engineer. In that lifetime of work, I designed bridges that connected communities, schools where children learned to dream, houses where families built their futures, and roads that carried people toward their destinies. My hands shaped the infrastructure of lives I would never know, creating foundations for strangers' happiness. Today, the only thing I design is the architecture of my own isolation, carefully constructed day by day, hour by hour. I live alone in a house I built with my own calloused hands, brick by painstaking brick, beam by measured beam. This home was once alive, pulsing with the warmth of a family, rich with the aroma of Lorena's cooking that would drift from the kitchen like an invitation to happiness. Sunday mornings brought the gentle chaos of family arguments, the kind that dissolved into laughter before the coffee grew cold. Music from our old record player would fill every corner, creating a soundtrack for a life that felt full and meaningful. Now, there is only the hollow whisper of wind slipping through windows I rarely open, and the merciless ticking of the living room clock that marks each passing hour like a countdown to nothing. Lorena, my Lorena, was my partner for more than 30 years. 3 decades of shared dreams, shared struggles, shared silences that spoke of deep understanding. We raised 2 children together, Rafael and Camila. Good kids, I told myself then. Smart, capable, loving, or so I desperately wanted to believe. When the divorce papers arrived, I felt like a man trying to solve an equation with variables that kept changing. Lorena looked me in the eye and said she needed to live something new, as if our entire life together had been some kind of dress rehearsal. I convinced myself it was one of those late life crises that strike when people suddenly realize they've been sleepwalking through their own existence. I thought it was temporary madness, a fever that would break. But she left with a single suitcase in her hand and a light in her eyes that I had never seen in all our years together, a light that had never been meant for me. These days, my children contact me with the mechanical precision of a scheduled medication. Once a month, always on the same day, always with the same hollow tone that echoes through the phone line like a voice from a distant planet. "Hey Dad, how are you holding up? Is there anything you need?" They speak to me as if I'm a terminal patient in hospice care, someone to be managed and monitored from a safe distance. After these brief, obligatory conversations, silence descends like a heavy curtain. No surprise visits, no invitations to family gatherings, not even a phone call on my last birthday when I sat alone with a store-bought cake and wished for the first time in my life that I could simply disappear. I know exactly what they see when they think of me, if they think of me at all. A stubborn old fool clinging to an outdated house like a shipwreck survivor refusing to let go of driftwood. A man too proud or too stupid to adapt to a world that has moved on without him. To accept that life is a river that never stops flowing, carrying some of us toward new shores while leaving others stranded on forgotten banks. But what they cannot see, what they refuse to acknowledge, is that I am still here. Still thinking with the same sharp mind that once calculated load-bearing weights and stress points. Still feeling with the same heart that once overflowed with love for them. Still remembering every birthday party, every bedtime story, every moment when I believed I was building something lasting and beautiful. Still waiting. And then, on a morning that began like countless others, grey sky, bitter coffee, the familiar weight of solitude settling on my shoulders like an old coat. What remained of my carefully ordered existence began to crumble. It started with something so ordinary, so innocuous, that I almost missed it entirely. A letter, a simple white envelope from the bank, mixed in with the usual stack of bills and advertisements that I barely glanced at anymore. But inside that unremarkable envelope lay the first thread of a web so intricate, so carefully woven from lies, betrayal, and calculated cruelty, that it would take me months to trace its full design. A web spun by someone I had loved more deeply, more completely, than I had ever loved my own reflection in the mirror. Someone I had trusted with not just my heart, but with the very foundation of everything I thought I knew about my life. It was a Friday morning painted in deceptive tranquility. Clear azure skies stretched endlessly overhead while a sharp, biting wind carved through the empty streets. I woke at precisely 6 a.m., my internal clock as reliable as Swiss machinery. After 4 decades of rising before dawn for the construction site, my body had become a slave to routine. It doesn't matter if it's the weekend, a national holiday, or if my calendar sits completely blank. My eyes snap open at the same time every morning. Old habits don't simply die, they burrow deeper into your bones, becoming part of your very architecture. After brewing my usual strong black coffee and taking a brief constitutional to the end of my street, a ritual that helped my aging joints remember they still functioned, I shuffled to the mailbox with the unhurried gait of a man who had earned his leisure. The metal box was stuffed to capacity with the usual debris of modern life: electricity bills with their increasingly alarming figures, colorful pharmacy advertisements promising miracle cures, and a glossy flyer advertising orthopedic mattresses for people exactly like me. But nestled beneath this mundane collection was something that made my pulse quicken. A pristine white envelope bearing the unmistakable corporate logo of Banco Santos e Lima embossed in the upper left corner. I'd maintained my account there for nearly 3 decades. A simple savings account, nothing fancy, just the repository for money earned through honest sweat and calloused hands, accumulated penny by penny over years of disciplined living. Something felt wrong even before I broke the seal. This type of correspondence typically arrived with clockwork precision at the beginning of each month, yet here we were on the 14th. The envelope bore all the hallmarks of official bank communication: the weight of expensive paper, the precise printing, my name spelled correctly in formal typeface. I convinced myself it was probably routine business, perhaps a change in statement format, maybe some tedious policy update that would join the pile of documents I never quite got around to reading. I retreated to the sanctuary of my living room, settling into the worn leather armchair that had molded itself to my body over the years. With the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to expect the worst from official correspondence, I slid my finger beneath the envelope's flap. Nothing could have prepared me for what followed. My hands began trembling before I'd even processed the full meaning of the first paragraph. Dear Mr. Leonardo Vasquez, thank you for utilizing your approved credit line with our institution. The amount of $800,000 has been processed and is now available in accordance with the loan agreement executed at our downtown branch location on the 3rd of this month. Should you require any clarification regarding the terms of this arrangement, our customer service team remains at your complete disposal. Time seemed to fracture. I read the words once, then again, my mind desperately trying to reject their meaning. 800,000 rees, a credit line, a signed contract. Each phrase struck me like a physical blow, the carefully constructed reality of my orderly existence cracking beneath their weight. I had never, not once in my entire adult life, taken out a loan of any kind. Debt wasn't just something I avoided, it was something I feared with an almost religious intensity. I had purchased my modest house with cash saved over 15 years. I had never financed a vehicle, preferring to drive second-hand cars until their engines surrendered. Every purchase, from groceries to clothing, was made with my debit card or bills pulled from my worn wallet. My financial philosophy was carved in stone. If I couldn't afford something immediately, I simply didn't need it. And now this institution, which had safeguarded my money for decades, was thanking me for a debt that existed only in some parallel universe. A cold dread settled in my stomach, not the sharp pain of indigestion, but something far more insidious. It felt as though invisible hands had reached into my carefully ordered existence and begun rearranging the fundamental pieces of who I was. My identity, my financial integrity, my very sense of self seemed suddenly negotiable, subject to manipulation by forces I couldn't see or comprehend. I rose from my chair with the uncertain movements of a man whose legs had forgotten their purpose. The telephone seemed miles away. I dialed the bank's customer service number, my fingers struggling to find the correct digits. What followed was an exercise in corporate purgatory. 5 interminable minutes of synthesized classical music, punctuated by recorded messages, assuring me that my call was extremely important to them, while simultaneously demonstrating the precise opposite through their indifference. Finally, a human voice emerged from the electronic wilderness. "Am I speaking with Mr. Leonardo Vasquez?" The attendant's tone carried the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered both good news and catastrophes with identical inflection. "Yes, that's correct. I'm calling about a letter I received today regarding some kind of loan arrangement. There's been a serious mistake. I never applied for or authorized any such transaction." The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably, filled only by the soft clicking of computer keys. "Sir, according to our comprehensive records, you appeared in person at our downtown branch office on the 3rd of this month. You presented all required identification documents and personally executed the loan agreement. Everything appears to have been processed according to standard protocol." "That's absolutely impossible." The words exploded from me with a force that surprised us both. I could feel my blood pressure spiking, my carefully maintained composure dissolving. "I was at home the entire day on the 3rd. I can prove it. And absolutely no one, no family member, no friend, no representative of any kind has authorization to conduct business on my behalf." "I understand your concern, Mr. Vasquez, but our documentation is quite thorough. We have photocopies of your signature and your identification documents on file. Everything appears to be legitimate and properly executed." The room began to spin slightly. My carefully ordered world was disintegrating in real time, and I was powerless to stop it. If they possessed my signature and my identification documents, there was only one terrifying explanation that made sense. "Someone has forged my documents," I whispered, the words tasting bitter and foreign in my mouth. "This is fraud. This is identity theft. This is a crime of the highest order. I demand an immediate meeting with your branch manager." "Certainly, sir. We can arrange a conference for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Will that be satisfactory?" I terminated the call without another word, my hand shaking as I returned the receiver to its cradle. My breathing had become shallow and rapid, as though the oxygen in the room had suddenly grown thin. I stared at the letter lying innocently on my coffee table, its white surface now seeming to pulse with malevolent energy. For the first time in many years, perhaps decades, I felt the cold grip of genuine terror. Not the fear of physical death, which seemed almost peaceful by comparison, but something far worse. The fear of being systematically erased while my heart still beat, of watching my identity dissolve into someone else's criminal enterprise while I stood helplessly by. By 11 a.m., I remained imprisoned in my leather armchair, the bank letter clutched in my increasingly clammy hands like evidence of my own destruction. My heart hammered against my ribs with the irregular rhythm of a machine breaking down. The violation I felt transcended the merely financial. This was an assault on the very core of my being, an invasion that reached deeper than stolen money could ever penetrate. My identity itself had been harvested, weaponized, turned against me with surgical precision. A scheme of this magnitude doesn't materialize from thin air. This wasn't some opportunistic street criminal stumbling into a bank with a hastily forged identification card, hoping to charm their way into a few thousand reais. No, this required intimate knowledge, careful planning, and access to information that only a select few possessed. Someone had studied me, mapped my habits, understood my vulnerabilities well enough to replicate my very essence on paper. The realization made my skin crawl. This had to be someone from my inner circle, someone who had once shared my trust, my secrets, my life. The shrill ring of the telephone shattered my spiral of paranoid thoughts. The caller ID display showed a name that made my blood freeze in my veins. Lorena, my ex-wife, the woman who had once whispered promises of eternal devotion into my ear during warm summer nights, who had sworn to weather every storm by my side, who had painted elaborate fantasies of growing old together in rocking chairs on our front porch. The same woman who had ultimately reduced our 2-decade marriage to a stack of legal documents and a hastily packed suitcase left by the front door like an abandoned piece of luggage. I stared at her name pulsing on the screen, my finger hovering over the answer button as though it were a detonator. "Hello?" I managed, my voice carefully modulated to betray nothing. "Leo?" Her voice poured through the speaker like honey laced with poison, dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my stomach lurch. "What an absolutely delightful surprise to hear your voice. I was just thinking about you, actually. I was wondering if I might stop by later today. Maybe we could share some coffee like old times, catch up properly, you know?" The performance was masterful, I had to admit. But I knew Lorena better than she realized. Spontaneous gestures weren't part of her operational vocabulary. Since our divorce had been finalized, our interactions had been clinical affairs. Brief text messages about paperwork that needed signing, terse discussions about practical matters that required resolution. Every exchange had been conducted with the emotional temperature of a business transaction. And now, out of nowhere, she wanted to reminisce over coffee. "Is everything all right with you, Lorena?" I asked, each word carefully weighted, designed to probe beneath her cheerful facade. "Oh, I'm absolutely wonderful." She laughed with a breathiness that transported me back to 1995, when that same laugh had made me believe in forever. "Actually, I have some truly exciting news to share, but I'd much rather tell you face to face. Would this afternoon work for you?" The silence that followed felt pregnant with unspoken accusations. My mind raced through the connections, the fraudulent loan, the forged documents, the impossible timing, and now the sudden resurrection of a woman who had been content to treat me as a stranger for months. The mathematical precision of the coincidence was staggering. "Sure," I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant and foreign even to my own ears. The words scraped against my throat like broken glass. "Come over whenever you'd like." I set the phone down with the deliberate care of someone handling unstable explosives and remained frozen in place, the device still radiating warmth from our brief connection. This was no coincidence. Coincidences this elaborate didn't exist in the real world. Lorena had never been impulsive, never acted without careful calculation. If she was suddenly eager to visit, it was because something had compelled her to do so, and that something reeked of bank letterhead and fraudulent signatures. My legs felt unsteady as I rose from the chair and made my way to the hallway cabinet. a piece of furniture that had become the repository for the administrative debris of my existence. I pulled open the drawer where I maintained my collection of vital documents, backup identification cards, birth certificates, insurance policies, and copies of significant contracts from years past. I rifled through the familiar papers with increasing desperation, my hands growing more frantic with each passing second. Everything seemed to be in its proper place, except for one crucial item that I had almost forgotten existed until this moment. The printed copy of my digitized signature was gone. Years ago, during some long-forgotten bureaucratic procedure, I had needed to provide a clean digital copy of my signature for official purposes. After completing the task, I had printed a reference copy and filed it away, thinking it might prove useful someday. It was such a minor detail, so insignificant that it had vanished completely from my conscious memory. Until now. Until it wasn't there. The migraine that had been building behind my eyes exploded into full bloom. Lorena. Of course it was Lorena. Until recently she had maintained access to this house, these rooms, these private spaces. She knew every hiding place, every organizational system, every password I had ever used. The divorce decree might have legally severed her claim to the property, but in practical terms, she had never truly departed from my life. I had trusted her with everything, and apparently she had taken everything, including things I didn't even know I possessed. The pieces of the puzzle were sliding into place with horrible clarity. The loan application, the forged signature, the missing document, and now the perfectly timed social visit from a woman who hadn't smiled at me without ulterior motive in years. The serpent had indeed returned to Eden. But this time, I was no longer the same naive man who had once believed in promises whispered in the dark. This time, I would be ready for her. The following morning arrived with merciless punctuality, though my alarm clock never got the chance to fulfill its purpose. My cell phone had already begun its urgent vibration against the wooden nightstand, the sound cutting through my restless sleep like a blade. I fumbled for the device with eyes still heavy from a night spent wrestling with paranoid thoughts, squinting at an unfamiliar number that bore the unmistakable area code of my banking district. Mr. Ricardo? The voice that greeted me was crisp and professional, tinged with the kind of artificial courtesy that immediately signals trouble. This is Daniel, calling from the credit department at Banco Centralis. I sincerely apologize for contacting you at such an early hour, but I'm afraid we have an urgent matter that requires your immediate attention regarding a loan account in your name that has fallen into delinquency. My brain struggled to process the words, still wrapped in the fog of interrupted sleep. The room seemed to tilt slightly as consciousness crashed over me like a cold wave. I'm sorry, what exactly do you mean by a loan? I managed to croak, my voice rough and unfamiliar as I struggled to sit upright in bed. My heart had begun that familiar, terrifying rhythm of panic. I haven't applied for any loan whatsoever. The voice on the other end maintained its professional veneer, but I detected something else lurking beneath the surface. A hesitation, perhaps even discomfort with the conversation he was required to have. Sir, are you aware of a personal loan that was approved and disbursed approximately 8 months ago in the amount of $480,000? According to our records, the first installment became due last month, followed by the second payment just yesterday. Both remain unpaid. I launched myself from the bed with such force that I nearly lost my footing, my legs tangling in the bedsheets as adrenaline flooded my system. My hands had begun trembling uncontrollably. 480,000 reais? The number seemed to exist in some alternate reality where mathematics had gone insane. Whose name appears on the contract documentation? I demanded, though part of me already dreaded the answer. The loan agreement was executed using digital signature protocols, sir. The documentation also lists Ms. Carla Martins de Souza as the primary beneficiary and designated financial dependent. The phone nearly slipped from my grasp. The room began spinning with sickening velocity, and I had to grip the edge of my dresser to remain upright. Carla. Of course it was Carla. The bank representative's voice seemed to fade into some distant dimension, his words becoming meaningless background noise against the deafening echo of that name, reverberating through my skull. Carla. The woman who had occupied a full decade of my existence, who had once whispered declarations of eternal love against my chest during quiet Sunday mornings, who had made elaborate plans for our shared future. The same woman who was now systematically dismantling my financial existence to fund her new life with another man. I forced myself back to the present moment, my voice barely steady enough to form words. "Can you provide me with the address where these funds were transferred?" He rattled off the information with bureaucratic efficiency, and I scrawled it down with a hand that shook so violently I could barely control the pen. A prestigious gated community in the most exclusive section of the city. A neighborhood I had never set foot in, miles away from anywhere she had ever worked or lived during our time together. This was another universe entirely. The parallel reality where she had been constructing her secret existence, brick by brick, using my identity as the foundation. I terminated the call without ceremony and stumbled toward my laptop with the unsteady gait of a man whose world had just been revealed as an elaborate illusion. My fingers moved across the keyboard with desperate urgency as I accessed every financial monitoring system I could think of. Sarasa, banking portals, credit reporting agencies. What I discovered was nothing short of financial apocalypse. A luxury SUV financed to the tune of $220,000, complete with leather interior and premium sound system. 2 high-limit credit cards bearing over $80,000 in accumulated installment purchases. Designer clothing, expensive electronics, fine dining establishments I had never heard of. And that devastating $480,000 loan, now officially 2 payments behind schedule, with late fees compounding like interest on borrowed time. Every contract signature, every billing statement, every mailing address formed a constellation that pointed inexorably toward her new life, her new address, her new reality built on the ruins of my trust. What shattered me wasn't merely the staggering debt, though that was catastrophic enough. It was the brutal, inescapable realization that none of this had been accidental. This wasn't a moment of weakness, a spontaneous decision made in the heat of desperation. This was architecture. This was engineering. This was a systematic, cold-blooded campaign of financial assassination that had been executed with surgical precision over months, possibly years. While I had been working 16-hour days at construction sites, my body aching and my hands bleeding from honest labor, she had been methodically converting my identity into an endless source of credit. Every luxury she now enjoyed, the gleaming SUV, the designer wardrobe, the upscale dining experiences, the exclusive address, had been purchased with the sweat equity of the fool she had so casually discarded. My heart felt as though it was being compressed in a vice, but something fundamental was beginning to shift within my chest. The crushing weight of betrayal was slowly being joined by something else, something that burned rather than merely ached. Indignation, righteous fury, the kind of anger that doesn't dissipate with time, but instead crystallizes into something harder, more dangerous. In that moment of terrible clarity, I understood the complete scope of her betrayal. She hadn't simply broken my heart or damaged my finances. She had systematically erased my existence, transforming me into nothing more than a resource to be harvested for someone else's benefit. And she had no intention of stopping. Why would she? I had been the perfect victim, trusting, predictable, completely unaware of the weapon my own identity had become in her hands. But something had changed. The naive man who had once believed in forever was gone, incinerated in the fire of this revelation. In his place stood someone harder, someone angrier, someone who understood that mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. I was finally, truly awake. And when a man awakens from this kind of betrayal, he doesn't simply roll over and return to sleep, not until every debt has been repaid in full. And some debts, I was beginning to understand, couldn't be settled with money. That morning never truly concluded. It simply transformed into something else entirely, becoming the opening chapter of a personal hell I was only beginning to comprehend. The sun continued its arc across the sky, but time itself seemed to have become elastic, stretching each moment into an eternity of rage and disbelief. These emotions swirled together in my chest like a toxic cocktail, but beneath them lurked something far more dangerous, an overwhelming, consuming need to take action. I found myself anchored to my kitchen table like a man afraid to move, the bank letter spread beside my open laptop like evidence at a crime scene. My eyes stared into the middle distance, unfocused, as my mind grappled with a question that seemed to have no answer. Where does one even begin when confronting someone who has orchestrated your destruction with such methodical, cold-blooded precision? The silence in my house felt oppressive, pregnant with the weight of decisions I wasn't yet ready to make. I realized with startling clarity that I couldn't navigate this labyrinth alone. I needed someone who understood the legal landscape, someone who could translate my fury into actionable strategy. There was only one person I trusted completely with matters this serious: Carlos. My oldest friend and the most experienced lawyer I knew, a man who had guided me through legal complexities in the past with patience and wisdom. I reached for my phone with hands that still trembled slightly and dialed his number. I recounted the entire nightmare in excruciating detail, pausing frequently to catch my breath between the most devastating revelations. Carlos listened with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to hearing people's worst moments, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never interrupting my flow. When I finally exhausted my litany of betrayals, the silence that followed felt heavy with implications. "Leonardo," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of professional concern mixed with personal sympathy, "what you're describing constitutes multiple serious felonies. Identity falsification, sophisticated bank fraud, systematic misuse of personal documents, and the most concerning aspect is that all of this was executed by someone with intimate access to your private life. You need to begin gathering evidence immediately. Every statement, every letter, every record, any video surveillance that might exist. Time is absolutely critical here." His words hit me like a splash of cold water, shocking me out of my paralyzed state. He was absolutely right. I couldn't afford to remain passive while the debt continued to compound and the banks intensified their pressure. And Lorena, she was still out there, free, apparently untouchable, probably confident that I would never discover the full scope of her betrayal. Carlos continued with the methodical precision that had made him such an effective attorney. "You need to immediately demand from the bank every document related to these fraudulent contracts and signatures. More importantly, you should request access to internal security footage from the branch location on the specific day the contract was allegedly signed. That video evidence could be the key to everything." As I ended the call, I felt something stirring within me that I hadn't experienced in what felt like years. Hope. Not the naive optimism of my younger self, but something harder and more determined. The hope that even after enduring this systematic destruction, there might still be a pathway back to justice, back to reclaiming my stolen identity. The days that followed became a blur of consultations, phone calls, and meetings, each one adding another piece to the increasingly complex puzzle of Lorena's deception. I became a regular presence at the bank, speaking with managers at every level, requesting copies of documents, demanding access to records that should have been mine by right. Some materials were provided readily enough, but others, particularly the signature specimens, remained mysteriously unavailable, tied up in bureaucratic red tape that felt suspiciously deliberate. A growing suspicion began to take root in my mind. Lorena's operation was more sophisticated than I had initially imagined. Perhaps she had cultivated an insider at the bank, someone with irregular access to internal systems, someone who could smooth the way for fraudulent transactions and then obscure the evidence afterward. The thought made my blood run cold. How deep did this conspiracy go? On my third increasingly frustrated visit to the bank, I encountered a different kind of employee entirely. Mariana was a young attendant whose eyes held genuine sympathy rather than the practiced indifference I had grown accustomed to receiving. She seemed to understand not just the technical details of my case, but the human devastation behind the paperwork. As our conversation was concluding, she leaned closer and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Leonardo, if I were in your position, I would strongly consider requesting the security footage from the day of the alleged contract signing. That kind of evidence, it could clarify everything. It could prove whether you were actually present that day or not." Her words hit me like lightning, illuminating a darkened landscape. Of course, the security cameras. In my emotional turmoil, I had overlooked the most obvious form of evidence available. Every bank maintains comprehensive video surveillance, and those recordings would provide irrefutable proof of my innocence. I needed that footage. It represented my best chance to prove definitively that I had never set foot in that branch on the day in question. That someone else, someone who looked enough like me, or had access to convincing identification, had impersonated me to execute this elaborate fraud. But even as hope surged through me, a darker realization followed close behind. Lorena wasn't stupid. She knew me better than almost anyone, understood how I thought, how I would react to discovery. She would anticipate that I would seek evidence, that I would fight back. This knowledge meant that the battle ahead wouldn't be resolved through polite conversations and civilized legal procedures. I had just declared war on someone who had been planning this campaign for months, possibly years. And wars, I was beginning to understand, rarely end the way anyone expects them to. The following morning arrived with crystalline clarity, cutting through the fog of confusion and despair that had clouded my judgment for days. I awakened not with the usual weight of dread pressing down on my chest, but with something sharper, more focused, pure determination. The time for wallowing in self-pity had expired. I couldn't allow this systematic destruction of my identity to continue consuming me while I remained paralyzed by shock and betrayal. The debt accumulating in my name, the silent lie that was methodically erasing my existence. I needed irrefutable proof, concrete answers that could stand up in court. The moment for decisive action had finally arrived. I retrieved my car keys from the kitchen counter. They belonged to an aging sedan that had sat largely unused since my retirement, gathering dust like so many other remnants of my former life. The drive to the Centralis Bank branch downtown stretched before me like a pilgrimage. Each mile weighted with anticipation and barely contained anxiety. My mind churned through endless permutations of questions and suspicions, building scenarios and tearing them down again. The bank buzzed with typical morning activity when I arrived. Customers formed orderly lines to open new accounts, resolve billing disputes, and conduct the mundane financial transactions that keep modern life functioning. But for me, this sterile corporate environment represented something far more significant. It was the potential site where I might finally uncover the truth, or at least whatever fragments of it remained after Lorena's careful manipulation. I approached the reception desk with the measured steps of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times. The young woman behind the counter, professional and courteous in that carefully trained way of customer service representatives, listened as I explained my need to access security camera footage from the 3rd, that now infamous date that had become the pivot point of my destroyed life. She directed me to the head of security, introducing him as Marcos, a man whose stern expression and military bearing suggested he had seen every variety of human deception imaginable. Marcos received me in a cramped, windowless office with grey walls that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who entered. A large monitor sat dark and silent in the corner, its black screen waiting like a portal to reveal secrets I desperately needed to see. I laid out my entire story for him. The fraudulent loan, the systematic misuse of my personal documents, the forged signature that had somehow convinced bank officials to release 800,000 reais to a woman who had already stolen my trust. Marcos listened with the impassive attention of a professional investigator, his weathered face betraying nothing as he absorbed each devastating detail. "Mr. Vasquez," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of institutional procedure, "our security footage is archived for a maximum of 30 days before automatic deletion. Today, being the 20th, means the recordings you need may still exist in our system. However, accessing and releasing that footage requires either an official court order or a formal police report that establishes this matter as an active criminal investigation." His words struck me like a physical blow. The bureaucratic catch-22 was maddening. How could I obtain a court order without the evidence I needed the court order to access? But I recognized the logic. Even as it frustrated me, if I truly wanted justice to prevail, I would have to take the first frightening step into the official legal process. The drive home felt like a retreat. But by the time I reached my house, my resolve had crystallized into something harder. I turned around immediately and drove to the local police station, my hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled determination. The officer who processed my complaint was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who seemed all too familiar with cases like mine. Identity theft, document forgery, financial fraud perpetrated by those closest to the victims. She meticulously recorded my information, asked probing questions designed to establish the scope of the crime, and documented every detail with the thoroughness of someone who understood how crucial accuracy would be in court. The days that followed blurred together into a relentless cycle of activity, repeated trips to the bank for additional documentation, strategy sessions with Carlos as we mapped our legal approach, endless phone calls to various bureaucratic departments, and sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling while my mind raced through possibilities and contingencies. We requested comprehensive bank statements, examined contracts with forensic attention to detail, and searched for any microscopic sign that could expose the forgery and prove my innocence. In the midst of this bureaucratic warfare, a small but significant victory emerged from the chaos. The bank finally provided a copy of the allegedly signed contract, complete with the digitized signature that had somehow convinced them I was requesting hundreds of thousands of reais in credit. What I discovered when examining that signature filled me with a mixture of vindication and fury. There, embedded within what was supposed to be my own handwriting, was a telltale imperfection, a small but crucial spelling error. One particular letter, L, appeared hesitant, uncertain, as though someone had attempted to replicate my natural writing style, but hadn't been entirely confident in their mimicry. It was the kind of mistake that happens when forgery is executed under pressure, when the perpetrator is more focused on speed than perfection. Carlos examined the signature with the intensity of a detective studying crime scene evidence. These kinds of inconsistencies are extremely common in rushed forgeries, he explained, his voice carrying the excitement of a lawyer who had just found a crack in the opposition's armor. This hesitation, this uncertainty in the stroke pattern, it's exactly the type of evidence that can demonstrate bad faith and fraudulent intent to a judge. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the ground beneath my feet becoming solid again. This wasn't just suspicion or circumstantial evidence. This was concrete proof that someone had attempted to replicate my signature and had failed to do so perfectly. It was my first real ammunition in what was shaping up to be a prolonged legal battle. The psychological shift was profound. I was no longer simply defending myself against accusations and mounting debt. I was no longer the passive victim of someone else's elaborate criminal enterprise. I had transitioned from defense to offense, from reaction to action. I possessed evidence, I had legal representation, and most importantly, I had the burning determination of a man who refused to be erased. I understood with perfect clarity that the battle ahead would be long and brutal. Lorena wouldn't surrender without deploying every weapon in her arsenal, wouldn't retreat gracefully when cornered. The emotional damage she had inflicted ran deeper than any mere financial calculation could measure, and the pain would likely persist long after the legal matters were resolved. But I was no longer the broken man who had sat in stunned silence just days earlier. I was prepared to reclaim my name, my dignity, and my life, regardless of the cost. The war she had started in shadow and deception would now be fought in the harsh light of legal scrutiny. The real battle was just beginning. As days passed, the weight of evidence and unanswered questions pressed down on me like a physical burden. I had concrete proof of forgery, legal proceedings in motion, and the machinery of justice slowly grinding forward. But something essential remained missing. I needed to hear it from her own lips. The truth, or at least whatever version of it she was prepared to admit. The confrontation I had been both dreading and craving could no longer be postponed. On a particularly grey afternoon when the sky seemed to mirror my internal turmoil, I made the decision that would define everything that followed. I drove across the city to the upscale neighborhood where Lorena now lived with Daniel, the younger man who, according to my children's reluctant admissions, had become the beneficiary of her sudden transformation into luxury. The building rose before me like a monument to my own naivety, its modern facade and manicured landscaping representing everything I had unknowingly financed through my stolen identity. I climbed to the 5th floor with legs that felt increasingly unsteady, my heart hammering against my ribs with each step. Outside her door, I paused to gather what remained of my composure, knowing that whatever happened next would alter the trajectory of both our lives forever. I pressed the doorbell with a finger that trembled despite my efforts to appear calm. The door opened before the chime had fully faded, as though she had been watching from the window, anticipating this inevitable moment. Leonardo. Her voice carried that familiar mixture of surprise and calculated sweetness that had once charmed me, but now sounded like poison wrapped in silk. Lorena. The word emerged from my throat with more force than I had intended, but I held her gaze without flinching. We need to have a conversation about what you've done to me. About what you're continuing to do to my name, my life, my future. She stepped aside with a smile that never touched her eyes, gesturing for me to enter the apartment that my stolen money had helped purchase. The interior was everything I had expected. Modern furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine, tasteful artwork on the walls, expensive touches everywhere that spoke of a lifestyle far beyond what her legitimate income could support. It was a shrine to the life she had built on the foundation of my destruction. I know that you know, she began without preamble, crossing her arms in a defensive posture that I recognized from countless arguments during our marriage. But the situation isn't as straightforward as you probably think it is. Isn't it? I asked, fighting to keep my voice level, even as rage threatened to consume my ability to speak rationally. You systematically forged my signature, accumulated hundreds of thousands of reais in debt using my identity, and used that money to purchase a home for your lover. Tell me, Lorena, what would you call that if not straightforward theft? She moved toward the window with the fluid grace of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind, staring out at the city below, as though the answers to her crimes might be written in the urban landscape. I needed to escape from that existence, Leo. We were drowning in mediocrity, trapped in a life that had become nothing but pretense and routine. You never understood the suffocation I felt, always complaining about money, always expecting me to remain the woman I was 20 years ago. But people evolve. I evolved. You evolved into a criminal, I responded, my voice cracking with the strain of containing emotions that threatened to overwhelm me entirely. You betrayed the most fundamental trust that exists between two people. You used my identity as raw material for your new life. You didn't just steal my money. You stole my reputation, my peace of mind, my faith in human decency. She turned to face me then, and I saw what appeared to be tears gathering in her eyes. Though after everything I had discovered, I couldn't determine whether they represented genuine remorse or simply another calculated performance designed to manipulate my emotions. I never intended to cause you this kind of pain, Leo. I just wanted freedom, liberation from that cramped old house, from the endless cycle of work and worry and making do with less. I wanted to feel alive again, to experience the kind of life I had always dreamed about but never thought I could achieve. And destroying my existence was your definition of freedom. The words emerged from somewhere deep in my chest, carrying decades of accumulated hurt and bewilderment. Creating financial ruin for the man who loved you was your path to feeling alive. Lorena lowered her head, her shoulders sagging with what might have been genuine shame, or simply exhaustion from maintaining her elaborate deceptions. I don't know what happens from this point forward, Leo. The legal machinery is already in motion, and I can't undo what I've done. All I know with certainty is, deep down, beneath all my justifications and rationalizations, I'm terrified. Terrified of what you might do with the evidence you've gathered. Terrified of the consequences that are finally catching up to me. I stepped closer, close enough to see the fine lines that had appeared around her eyes since our separation. Close enough to smell the expensive perfume that my stolen money had purchased. When I spoke, my voice carried a finality that surprised even me. I didn't come here seeking revenge, Lorena. I didn't come to gloat over your fear or to threaten you with what I might do next. I came here to salvage whatever remains of my dignity and my life, and to ensure that you face the full consequences of your choices. Not just the financial ones, but the moral and legal ones as well. The silence that followed seemed to expand until it filled every corner of the apartment, heavy with the weight of 20 years of shared history now poisoned beyond redemption. It was a silence thick with betrayal, saturated with sorrow, and pregnant with the unspoken promise that this confrontation was merely the prelude to a much longer, much more brutal reckoning. We both understood, without needing to articulate it, that the war between us was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning to reveal its true dimensions. After the confrontation, nothing would ever be the same. The visit to Lorena had left a mark on me. My mind was racing, my heart tight with emotion. Now the battle was no longer just emotional, it was legal. With the police report filed and the evidence beginning to surface, my lawyer Carlos and I prepared the paperwork to file a lawsuit against her for fraud, document forgery, and identity theft. The goal wasn't just to clear my name, it was to stop her from continuing to destroy my life. The bank, pressured by the situation, temporarily froze all activity related to the loans and financing taken out in my name. It was a partial relief, but there was still a long road ahead. The following days were a whirlwind of hearings, statements, and meetings with my lawyer. The local media, having caught wind of the story, began to take an interest. After all, who would have thought that a story of betrayal would turn into such an intense financial drama? My children, initially indifferent, started to draw closer, disturbed by the public attention and concerned for their father. It was a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that they were finally noticing me. Sadness that they had ignored me for so long. Lorena, for her part, maintained a carefully calculated silence. In the hearings, she avoided eye contact, answered evasively, and tried to downplay the severity of her actions. But the justice system isn't so easily fooled. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my life. I tried to return to some sort of routine, to take care of my health, and most of all, to keep my head held high. That battle had taught me a painful but necessary lesson. Trust is fragile, and justice is a constant fight. I still didn't know how it would all end, but I was determined not to let that fraud define me. I was more than a debt, more than a name used to deceive. I was a man fighting to rewrite his story. The days passed slowly, as if time itself had decided to toy with my patience. The feeling of being trapped in a maze with no exit, where every step led to another wall, consumed me. The hearings dragged on, papers piled up on my desk, and justice seemed to crawl at a turtle's pace, far too slow for the pain I carried in my chest. I felt like I was losing the battle, and my strength was beginning to fade. But just when hope seemed to vanish, life surprised me. It all started with a simple, anonymous email that appeared in my inbox on a grey morning. The sender didn't identify themselves, and the message contained only one sentence: "The truth is here." My heart skipped a beat. I hesitated for a moment, wondering whether I should open the attached file. But curiosity and the desperate need for answers won out. When I opened it, there it was, a short, shaky video, but clear enough to take my breath away. In the video, I instantly recognized Lorena and that man Daniel. The younger guy my children claimed was the reason behind her sudden luxurious lifestyle. They were inside the Centralis Bank branch, the same building where I had gone looking for evidence. Lorena was holding a folder full of documents, which she handed over to a bank employee, a man I had never seen before, but whose face would now be etched into my memory. The employee gave a discreet smile and, in a nearly imperceptible gesture, slid an envelope toward Lorena. That simple movement spoke louder than any words. It was proof that the bank not only knew about the fraud, but was actively facilitating it, a conspiracy to destroy my life and protect those behind it. My eyes burned with emotion. It was the confirmation I had suspected all along. Without wasting a second, I called Carlos, the lawyer who had been with me since the beginning of this war. "Carlos," my voice trembled, a mix of relief and excitement. "We have a video. Clear evidence of collusion between Lorena and a bank employee. This changes everything." He responded with a steady voice, filled with hope. "That's pure gold, Leonardo. With this, we can immediately request a freeze on the debt, file criminal charges against those involved, and pressure the bank to be held accountable." The news sparked a new energy inside me. I was no longer fighting alone, nor against shadows. I now held a powerful weapon in my hands, the truth. The case gained new momentum. The defense of my name and my honor finally seemed within reach. But amidst this turning point, I knew this victory wouldn't come easy. There was still a long road ahead, obstacles to overcome, battles to be fought. And yet, for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that, despite the betrayal, the pain, and the fraud, I might still find redemption. And in that moment, I realized that this breakthrough wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where I would no longer be a victim, but a man determined to rebuild his life, no matter the cost. With the video in hand, a mix of relief and apprehension took hold of me. Relief, because I finally had concrete proof that showed the truth. Apprehension, because I knew this was just the first battle in a war far from over. Carlos, my lawyer, acted swiftly and with surgical precision. Within hours, he filed a request with the court for a permanent freeze on the fraudulent debts being charged to my name, a crucial step to prevent my reputation from being further destroyed. In addition, he opened a criminal case against my ex-wife Lorena, the bank employee caught on the video, and any other accomplices who might surface. But to my surprise and frustration, the bank reacted vehemently. They vehemently denied the video's authenticity, claiming the footage could have been tampered with, a hollow argument. but one powerful enough to sow doubt in the minds of the less attentive. They tried to dodge responsibility, placing all the blame on Lorena as if they were mere innocent victims. I expected this tactic. Banks and large institutions know how to play this game: delay proceedings, confuse the justice system, wear down the victim. The goal was clear: to make me give up. The hearings began to follow one another in an exhausting routine. Each session was a test of emotional and physical endurance. I had to relive my pain in front of the judge, the defense lawyers, and Lorena herself, who appeared as a cold and calculating woman sitting across the room, with eyes trying to hide the weight of guilt, or perhaps cynicism. Amid this storm, my children began to come closer. Reed and Perry, who had once seemed distant and uninterested, started calling me more often, asking how I was doing. They didn't say much, but their gestures comforted me. I knew they were wrestling with their own doubts and feelings, but at least they weren't leaving me alone. On the other hand, the case's exposure brought painful personal consequences. Long-time friends started to avoid me, some fearing involvement in a public scandal, others simply unable to handle the situation. The feeling of loneliness was intense, but I couldn't afford to falter. My routine turned into an endless marathon of meetings with lawyers, financial consultations, phone calls to banks and authorities, and countless legal appointments. Physical and mental exhaustion began to weigh on me, but I clung to one thing: the desire to clear my name and rebuild my life. The judge overseeing the case ordered detailed technical examinations. Experts were called to analyze the authenticity of the signatures, review the video, and investigate connections between Lorena and the bank employees. Slowly, the curtain of lies began to lift. With each small victory, a favorable forensic report, a convincing testimony, a provisional court ruling, I felt strength returning to my veins. I knew this was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for my dignity, for my story. Despite the constant tension, I sought to reclaim parts of my life that brought me peace. I returned to carpentry, an old passion I had neglected over the past years. Spending hours working with my hands, turning pieces of wood into something useful, helped clear my mind and strengthen my spirit. The betrayal I suffered still hurt deeply, but the ongoing justice gave me a new purpose. I was no longer a helpless victim, but a man determined to rewrite his story, no matter the cost. I stood at a crossroads. I could let myself sink into the shadows of the past, or choose to move forward, rebuilding my life with dignity and courage. I chose to fight. Justice was underway, and I was ready to face whatever came, with my head held high and my heart steadfast. The weeks following the start of the lawsuit were a true roller coaster of emotions. I spent endless hours in meetings with Carlos, reading documents, planning strategies, witnessing small victories, and the frustrations of hearings that seemed never-ending. The feeling of exhaustion was constant, both physically and emotionally. However, what I didn't expect was that, amid this turmoil, a remarkable twist would completely change the course of my story. It all began on a grey, rainy afternoon, while I was reviewing some evidence in my makeshift home office when the phone rang. The number was unknown, and for a moment I thought about not answering, but something inside me said I needed to hear that voice. On the other end of the line was a calm female voice, though laden with restrained urgency. "Mr. Leonardo, my name is Mariana. I work at Centralis Bank. We need to talk about your case. It's important." My heart raced. Mariana? The same friendly clerk who had helped me during some visits to the bank. Why was she reaching out now, in the middle of all this mess? She asked to meet at a discreet cafe, away from prying eyes. I agreed immediately, sensing that something important was about to happen. When we met, Mariana seemed nervous but determined. After making sure we were safe from eavesdropping, she began speaking softly. "I couldn't stand watching what they were doing to you anymore. What your ex-wife Lorena and that bank employee are doing isn't an isolated case. There's a much bigger scheme involving several Centralis employees." She explained that the bank had an internal group that facilitated fraud with unsuspecting clients' data, illegally granting loans and financing in the names of people who didn't even know they were indebted. Lorena is part of a group that takes advantage of this scheme, Mariana continued. They have contacts inside the bank, access to documents and forged signatures, and use these connections to ensure loans get approved without many questions. Mariana then handed me a thick envelope filled with internal documents, audio recordings, exchanged emails between employees, and even footage from the bank's cameras that had never reached me during the official investigations. As I flipped through the evidence, a mix of relief and outrage overwhelmed me. Finally, the curtain hiding that entire web of lies was beginning to lift, but what moved me most was that woman's courage. Mariana was risking her career, her reputation, even her safety to help me expose the truth. She had become a key witness, an unexpected ally in my fight. With this new evidence, Carlos strengthened our lawsuit, expanding the case to target not only Lorena and the involved employee, but the entire corrupt network inside Centralis Bank. The fight became even more complex, more enemies, more risks. But it also became more just, because now the truth was starting to win. I felt this was the real chance to clear my name once and for all, and to prevent other innocent people from going through what I endured. The battle would be tough, but I was ready. And for the first time in a long time, I believed justice could truly prevail. The day of the trial finally arrived. After months of an exhausting battle, filled with paperwork, testimonies, anguish, and hope, I stood there, face to face with the justice I had longed for and now needed more than ever. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, onlookers, family members, and people who had followed my case for months sat in silent anticipation. The story of a man whose identity was stolen by his own ex-wife and a corrupt network within Centralis Bank had captured the attention of many. I sat in the defendant's seat, but I did not feel like a criminal. On the contrary, despite the tension and nervousness tightening my chest, I felt like a man fighting to reclaim his life, dignity, and honor. Lorena entered just behind me, her face stern and her eyes cold. Her lawyer tried to mask his anxiety, but I knew this moment was decisive for all of us. Carlos, my lawyer, gave me a confident look. "We are ready, Leonardo. We've done impeccable work." The judge opened the session with a firm voice, announcing the start of the trial. The testimonies began, and Mariana was the first to take the stand. She recounted with clarity and courage the corrupt scheme that existed inside the bank, detailing how Lorena and her accomplices used forged documents, collusion, and intimidation to approve fraudulent loans in my name. Other employees who were called corroborated her testimony, and the evidence, the secret recordings, documents, and video, dismantled the defense's attempt to minimize the facts. In that moment, a flood of emotions overwhelmed me. Sadness for the lost time, betrayal and pain caused, but also a feeling of impending justice that gave me strength to face it all. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom fell into an almost palpable silence. The judge looked at all parties and pronounced the sentence, "Considering the evidence presented, I find the defendants, Lorena Vasquez and the bank employee, guilty of fraud, document forgery, and misuse of identity. I hereby order the immediate annulment of the loan contract and the removal of Mr. Leonardo Vasquez's name from all delinquent records related to this fraud. Furthermore, Centralis Bank shall be fined and mandated to implement strict measures to prevent such practices from recurring, including frequent internal audits and staff training." Hearing those words, I felt the weight that I had carried lift from my shoulders. My hands trembled, and a solitary tear rolled down my face, not from weakness but from relief and victory. More than reclaiming my name, I was reclaiming my life. In the days that followed, I began rebuilding the bridges that had been broken with my children and friends. I reconnected with them with a new perspective, more open and sincere. I returned to my old hobbies, especially woodworking, which brought me peace and helped heal the emotional wounds left by betrayal. I had learned, in the hardest way possible, that trust is a precious commodity and that justice may be slow, but when it arrives, it transforms not only facts, but people. My story did not end as a tale of irreparable loss. On the contrary, it became proof that human resilience can overcome even the deepest betrayals. I had regained my name, my honor, and above all, my dignity. And now, I was ready to begin a new chapter, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before. After enduring the storm, with justice finally on my side and my name fully cleared, a strange feeling washed over me. The real possibility of starting over. The heavy curtain of betrayal and lies had been lifted, leaving space for me to finally see a new horizon, a path I hadn't even known existed before. The first and most important step was to take care of myself. The years of anguish, loneliness, and struggle had left deep marks both on my body and soul. The pain didn't disappear overnight, but I decided I needed to rediscover my inner strength. I began embracing simple habits that brought me peace, morning walks in the park, reconnecting with nature, and practicing meditation. Something I'd never tried before, but quickly became an anchor for my restless mind. My children, who had been distant for so long, began appearing more often in my life. Reed and Perry, who once held brief, mechanical conversations, started sharing moments with me, dinners, outings, and even heartfelt talks about the past and the rifts that had separated us. Helen, my most difficult daughter, surprised me the most. Despite the wounds still open, she sought repair, a new bond no longer built on blame or bitterness. Those conversations weren't easy. There were tears, arguments, and many moments of silence, but something essential had finally arrived: honesty. For the first time, we allowed ourselves to speak without masks, to acknowledge mistakes, and above all, to forgive. The family's rebuilding was slow, but full of hope. Beyond the emotional healing, I needed to attend to the practical side of life. I returned to woodworking, an old passion that always brought me peace and a sense of accomplishment. Spending hours hammering, sanding, painting, and creating with my own hands was more than a hobby. It was therapy. Every piece of furniture I restored or crafted symbolized another step in my recovery, a fragment of my story pieced back together. I also decided to turn my experience into a warning for others. I started a blog detailing my story, not to seek sympathy, but to raise awareness about the hidden dangers behind a forged signature or an apparently harmless loan. I joined support groups for fraud victims and gave interviews on local programs. What had been a deep pain became a mission to help others avoid the same nightmare. The luxurious house Lorena had purchased with the fraudulent loan in my name was, by court order, reclaimed and returned to the family. We chose to sell it, and the proceeds helped pay off old debts and establish a solid financial plan for the future. It was a way to transform a symbol of my pain into a foundation for rebuilding. More than anything, I rediscovered my dignity. No longer the man who was betrayed, deceived, and nearly destroyed, but someone who, despite it all, lifted his head and moved forward with courage and determination. The struggle was not in vain. Now, when I look to the future, I see a vast field of possibilities. The shadows of the past that once paralyzed me are gone. There is only the light of hope and renewal. I know life will still bring challenges because that's how it is for all of us. But I am ready to face them with the same strength I used to win this battle. This is my new beginning, a chapter I write with the ink of overcoming, resilience, and hope. A chapter where I'm no longer the victim, but the author of my own story. And this story, finally, is mine. Life places us before challenges we never imagined facing. Sometimes we are blindsided by betrayals from the least expected places, by injustices that threaten not only our peace, but the very essence of who we are. My journey, marked by moments of deep pain and loss was also a path of discovery, about myself, about justice, and about the power of resilience. I learned that we cannot control the actions of others, but we always have the power to decide how to respond. When Lorena used my name to build a luxurious lie, she believed she could destroy me. But what she didn't know was that inside me burned a silent strength, a flame that refused to be extinguished. The battle was long and arduous. There were sleepless nights, days filled with uncertainty, moments when I thought about giving up. But the truth held a power greater than the lies that sought to imprison me. The truth revealed itself, not only in the evidence and documents, but in the courage of those willing to stand up against the system, to defend what is right. More than reclaiming my name, I gained something money could never buy: my dignity restored. I realized that justice is not an abstract concept, but a daily achievement that demands struggle, patience, and faith. My story is not just about fraud and trials, but about the human capacity to reinvent oneself even after the darkest storms. It is living proof that no matter how dark the night, the dawn always comes. To those facing their own battles, I leave this message: never lose hope. Every hardship is an opportunity to grow. Every fall, a chance to rise stronger. Don't let the shadows of your past overshadow the brightness of your future. The path to overcoming is not easy, but it is possible. And when truth prevails, it opens doors that lies could never even imagine. Today, when I look back, I feel proud of every step taken, because I'm not merely the victim of a sad story. I am the author of my rebirth. And this story, which began with pain and betrayal, ends with the certainty that we are far greater than any adversity. Life is an open book, and each of us writes our own destiny. May you have the courage to turn the page and begin your next chapter, filled with hope, strength, and faith in tomorrow. Because in the end, the truest victory is to remain faithful to yourself and never stop fighting for what is just and true.